Margaret stood at the window of her father's modest home watching the autumn leaves drift past like scattered dreams, and she thought about how quickly 20 years could pass, yet how slowly each day had moved in recent months since her father's illness had worsened and the debts had piled up like those same leaves against their doorstep. Her father Thomas had been a carpenter once and his hands had built beautiful things, but arthritis had twisted those capable fingers until he could no longer hold his tools properly, and the work had dried up along with their savings, and now there were whispers in town about the Baron's unusual offer. The Baron lived in the great house on the hill and no one in their small town had ever seen him up close in nearly 5 years, and the stories that circulated about him ranged from frightening to pitiful, and most people crossed to the other side of the street when his black carriage passed through town. Margaret had heard he'd been injured in some accident and that his face was scarred beyond recognition, and that he never attended church or social gatherings anymore and lived like a hermit with only a handful of servants who never spoke about what went on behind those iron gates. When her father told her about the proposal, she had simply nodded and asked when she would need to go, and Thomas had wept then and told her she didn't have to do this, but they both knew there were no other options, and the Baron had offered enough money to clear their debts and provide Thomas with care for the rest of his days. So on a gray October morning, Margaret packed her few belongings into a worn trunk and climbed into the Baron's carriage and tried not to think about how the driver wouldn't meet her eyes or how the townsfolk watched from their windows with expressions mixing pity and relief that it wasn't their daughter being sent away. The house was larger than she'd imagined and older too, with ivy climbing the stone walls like veins and windows that reflected the cloudy sky like blind eyes, and when the carriage stopped, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson greeted her at the door with a kind face that seemed out of place in such a forbidding setting. Mrs. Patterson showed her to a room that was surprisingly bright and comfortable, with fresh flowers on the dresser and clean linens on the bed, and she explained that Margaret would have her own space and the Baron had made it clear she was to be treated with utmost respect and given time to adjust to her new circumstances. That first week Margaret barely saw the Baron at all, and she took her meals in a small dining room while he apparently ate in his study, and Mrs. Patterson brought her books from the library and showed her the gardens where she could walk freely, and slowly Margaret began to understand that this wasn't quite the prison she'd imagined. On the 8th evening there was a note slipped under her door in careful handwriting that said he would like to meet her in the library after dinner if she was willing, and that she should not feel obligated and could take more time if needed, and something about the uncertainty in those written words made her decide to go. The library was warm with firelight and lined with more books than Margaret had ever seen, and the Baron stood with his back to her looking out the window, and when he finally turned she understood why he'd hidden himself away. The left side of his face was marked by terrible scars from a fire she would later learn about, and his eye on that side was clouded and sightless, and his mouth pulled slightly to one side, and she could see in his remaining good eye the expectation of her horror or disgust. But Margaret had spent months watching her father's hands become twisted and useless, and had learned that a person's worth wasn't in their appearance, and so she simply said good evening and asked if he would recommend which book she might read next, and she saw a surprise flicker across his damaged features. His name was William, and he was 38 and had once been engaged to a woman who'd left him after the fire that had destroyed part of his father's factory and scarred him beyond recognition, and he'd inherited everything when his parents passed and had slowly withdrawn from the world that stared or pitied or turned away. They began meeting in the library each evening, and at first they only talked about books, and Margaret found he was thoughtful and well-read and had opinions about everything from poetry to philosophy, and he listened when she spoke about her childhood and her father, and never once made her feel less than him despite the vast difference in their circumstances. Winter came and Margaret learned the rhythms of the house, and sometimes she would find small gifts left in her room and a warm shawl when the weather turned cold, or a book she'd mentioned wanting to read, and once a beautiful music box that played a melody her mother had loved before she passed years ago. She began to understand that William's isolation wasn't just about his scars but about a deep loneliness that had settled over him like snow, and how he'd forgotten how to be around people who might see him as something other than frightening or pitiful, and she realized she could help him remember. Margaret started joining him for dinner and suggesting they take walks in the garden even in the cold, and at first he was hesitant, but gradually he began to relax, and sometimes she would catch him almost smiling at something she said, and those moments felt like small victories. She told him about her father's carpentry and how he'd taught her to see the beauty in wood grain, and how every piece of timber had its own story, and William showed her his own collections and the things he'd loved before the fire, and slowly he began to emerge from the shell he'd built around himself. The townspeople noticed changes too because William began contributing to local charities again and having supplies sent to families in need, and though he still didn't venture into town himself, he was no longer the frightening hermit of local legend but rather a mysterious benefactor. Spring arrived and with it Margaret's 21st birthday, and William had Mrs. Patterson arrange a small celebration, and there was cake and flowers and a gift that made Margaret's breath catch, and it was a letter of credit that would provide for her father's care indefinitely with no strings attached. She found William in the garden that evening and asked him why he would do such a thing, and he said quietly that she'd given him something far more valuable than money, and she'd reminded him what it felt like to be human again and not just a monster hiding in shadows. Margaret realized then that somewhere between autumn and spring she'd stopped thinking of this arrangement as a transaction and had begun to care deeply for this man who read poetry aloud with passion and worried about people he'd never met and had somehow maintained kindness despite all the cruelty life had shown him. She told him this and watched his expression shift through surprise and disbelief and something that might have been hope, and he said he'd never expected anything from her beyond tolerance and certainly never imagined she might see him as anything other than the scarred recluse he'd become. But Margaret had learned long ago that real beauty had nothing to do with faces or bodies and everything to do with how someone treated others when they thought no one was watching, and by that measure William was the most beautiful person she'd ever known. Summer came and they spent long evenings talking in the garden, and William began to laugh again, and the sound was rusty at first like something long unused, but it grew stronger and more frequent, and Margaret thought about how healing wasn't always dramatic but sometimes just happened quietly over time. The townspeople were shocked when Margaret appeared at church one Sunday with William beside her, and there were stares and whispers, but she held her head high and kept her hand on his arm and refused to acknowledge anyone's discomfort, and slowly people began to nod in greeting. Mrs. Patterson told her later that she'd never seen William stand so tall or look so proud, and that Margaret had given him something no amount of money could buy, and that was the courage to face a world that had made him feel like he should hide. Margaret visited her father regularly, and Thomas wept when he saw how happy she was and said he'd been wrong to worry and that sometimes what looked like a sacrifice turned out to be a blessing, and Margaret agreed, though not in the way anyone had expected. As autumn returned and Margaret had been in William's house for a full year, he asked her one evening if she might consider staying, not out of obligation or arrangement but because she wanted to and because perhaps they might build something real together. She said yes without hesitation because she'd learned that love wasn't always the thunderbolt that stories promised, but sometimes it was the quiet growing thing that happened when two people saw each other truly and chose each other anyway, despite or maybe because of their scars, both visible and invisible. They married in the garden with only a handful of people present, and Margaret wore her mother's dress that Mrs. Patterson had carefully preserved, and William's hand shook when he placed the ring on her finger, and his voice was rough with emotion when he promised to spend his life trying to deserve her. The years that followed were peaceful and full, and they opened their home to others who felt lost or alone, and Margaret continued visiting her father until he passed quietly in his sleep, knowing his daughter was loved and cared for, and William became known in town not for his scars but for his generosity. People would often remark on how unexpected their story was and how no one could have predicted such a happy ending from such an unusual beginning, and Margaret would smile and say that sometimes the best things in life were the ones you never saw coming. She thought often about that October morning when she'd climbed into the Baron's carriage expecting nothing but duty and obligation, and how impossible it would have seemed then that she would find such profound happiness in that forbidding house on the hill. William would sometimes touch his scarred face unconsciously, and Margaret would take his hand and kiss it and remind him that she saw him whole and beautiful and exactly as he was meant to be, and he would look at her with wonder as if he still couldn't quite believe his fortune. They grew old together in that house with its ivy-covered walls and extensive library and garden that bloomed faithfully each spring, and they were happy in the quiet, steady way that matters most, and their love story became the kind that people told to prove that kindness and patience could transform everything. And Margaret never regretted that day she'd chosen courage over fear and duty over despair, because she'd learned that sometimes what looks like an ending is really just the beginning, and that the greatest adventures often start with a single act of grace and the willingness to see beyond surface appearances to the person underneath.